In Tampa, Florida, a young woman's life ended in unimaginable violence, and her killer chose to broadcast the horror for the world to see. This is the story of Bianca McGahey, just 25 years old, and Donovan Ruddick, a failed wrestler whose obsession spiraled into murder. In the summer of 2013, a shocking crime in Tampa, Florida would capture the attention of the public and leave a community reeling. At the center of the story was a man who had once tried to carve out a career in professional wrestling, a man who performed under the names Donovan Ruddick and D.T. Porter. To his peers inside the small wrestling circuit, he was a familiar face, someone who had spent years chasing the dream of recognition in an industry that thrived on showmanship and character. But outside the ring, Ruddick was a different figure altogether, burdened by personal struggles, anger, and a toxic relationship that ended in violence. His victim was his ex-girlfriend, Bianca McGahey, a 25-year-old woman who had her entire future ahead of her. The crime that unfolded was not only brutal, but marked by an element of public spectacle that disturbed everyone who came across it. Donovan Ruddick was in his late 30s by the time he was living in Tampa. His path to wrestling had been unconventional. Like many wrestlers, he adopted ring personas, creating an identity that was larger than life. Under the name Donovan Ruddick, he presented himself as a powerhouse, while under the name D.T. Porter, he leaned into a different character to fit the demands of his performances. Those who knew him from the wrestling scene saw him as someone trying to keep his career alive, even as he struggled to find consistent success. Outside the ring, however, his life showed signs of instability. His relationship with Bianca was troubled and ended badly, but his obsession with her did not fade. That obsession would drive him to commit an act of violence that no one who knew Bianca could have imagined. Bianca McGahey was 25 years old in 2013, living in Tampa, and doing the things many young adults do, working, socializing, and trying to build a future. Friends described her as kind and independent, someone with a warm personality who deserved the chance to live her life free from fear. For her, the relationship with Donovan was part of her past. But while she had moved forward, he had not. What Bianca could not have known was just how dangerous it was for her to be on his mind, and how the end of their relationship would eventually lead to tragedy. The crime itself was as shocking as it was cruel. On an ordinary day, Bianca went outside to walk her dog. She was on the phone as she made her way down the street, going about her routine with no sign that her life was about to be cut short. At some point during her walk, Donovan confronted her. Fueled by anger and jealousy, he pulled out a knife and attacked. Bianca was stabbed multiple times, her final moments spent in confusion and terror as the attack unfolded. The brutality of the murder alone was enough to horrify the community. But what happened next made the crime even more disturbing. After the murder, Donovan did something few could comprehend. Instead of hiding the evidence or running from what he had done, he took photos of the aftermath. He then posted those bloody images on Facebook, exposing the crime to the online world. Friends, acquaintances, and strangers who came across the images were horrified, and the act left no doubt as to who had committed the murder. It was a moment where violence and social media collided in the most unsettling way, showing not only the depth of Donovan's instability, but also his willingness to broadcast his actions for attention. For investigators, the evidence was damning. For the public, it was traumatizing. The story of Donovan Ruddick and Bianca McGahey is one of obsession, control, and the inability to let go. Bianca was a young woman at the beginning of her adult life, while Donovan was a man in his late 30s, older, and with years of frustration weighing on him. Their relationship had ended, but his desire to dominate her had not. That imbalance of power, combined with his obsession, created the conditions for violence. The attack was not a crime of passion that happened in a sudden burst of anger. It was the result of long simmering resentment and an inability to accept the reality of their separation. When word of the murder spread, the community in Tampa was stunned. Bianca's friends and family struggled to comprehend how someone they knew could be taken from them so violently. The fact that Donovan had chosen to share the evidence online only deepened the pain. Social media, a tool meant to connect people, had been used in the most twisted way possible. The theme of this case, one that would resonate long after the crime, was how obsession and violence can reach beyond the private sphere and spill into the public, leaving scars that extend far beyond the immediate act. The turning point in the story came not during the attack itself, but in Donovan's decision to reveal his crime through Facebook. In doing so, he made it impossible to deny what had happened or who was responsible. While most criminals try to hide their actions, Donovan flaunted his, and that single decision became the most damning piece of evidence. It turned the case from a tragedy into a spectacle, ensuring that the crime would be remembered not just for its brutality, but for the way it was made visible to the world. In the days following the murder, this act of digital confession set the tone for everything that came next. Investigators had no mystery to solve, only the task of piecing together the sequence of events that had led to Bianca's death and preparing the case that would ultimately bring Donovan to justice. For those who followed the story, the details were almost too disturbing to believe. A professional wrestler, a man used to creating characters and acting out violence in the ring, had taken real violence into the streets. A young woman, simply walking her dog, had become the target of that violence. And the world had been forced to see the aftermath through social media, an act that turned private horror into public trauma. In the early stages of the case, long before a trial or sentencing, what stood out most was the sheer brazenness of Donovan's actions, and the sense that this was not just a crime, but a deliberate display of power and control, even after his victim was gone. By the end of 2013, the murder of Bianca McGahey was widely recognized as one of the most shocking crimes in Tampa's recent history. The details of the attack, the ages and backgrounds of the people involved, and the role of social media combined to make it unforgettable. The crime was senseless, the loss immeasurable, and the community left to grapple with the knowledge that obsession can destroy lives in an instant. For investigators, there was no doubt that Donovan Ruddick would face justice. For Bianca's family, the focus was on remembering her as more than a victim, as a young woman whose life had been stolen before it had a chance to fully unfold. The murder of Bianca McGahey in 2013 did not fade quickly from public attention. In Tampa, Florida, the crime had shocked the community, and the disturbing detail of Donovan Ruddick posting bloody photos of his ex-girlfriend's death on Facebook turned it into a case that felt almost surreal. The initial shock soon gave way to a larger effort to piece together the full story. How a young woman in her mid-20s could lose her life so brutally. How a man in his late 30s who once stood in a wrestling ring under names like Donovan Ruddick and D.T. Porter could commit such an act. And how the authorities would move forward to make sure justice was done. For investigators, the case was unusual not because the killer was hard to identify, but because he had made it so easy. Typically, detectives must gather witness testimony, forensic evidence, and timelines to build a case. Here, Donovan himself had left behind the most incriminating evidence possible. The photos on Facebook were more than disturbing, they were proof. He had essentially broadcast his guilt to anyone watching, leaving no mystery as to who had carried out the crime. Yet even with such direct evidence, the investigation had to follow proper procedure. Every detail needed to be documented, every step of the crime reconstructed, so that the case against him would hold up in court. In the aftermath of the killing, Bianca's family and friends were left with grief that was almost impossible to put into words. Bianca had been only 25 years old. She was not a public figure, not someone used to attention, but suddenly her name was in news reports, her face in headlines, her story retold in articles and broadcasts. She had been taken in the most violent way, and the person responsible was someone she once trusted. To those who loved her, that betrayal cut deeply. They remembered her as warm, kind, and independent, someone whose life had been filled with promise. For them, the horror was not only that she had died, but that her death had been turned into a spectacle for the world to see. Meanwhile, for those who had known Donovan through wrestling, the news was jarring in a different way. The wrestling world thrives on creating characters, villains, and heroes who play out scripted rivalries in front of an audience. Violence in that context is staged, rehearsed, an illusion built for entertainment. Donovan had been part of that world for years, appearing in matches under his ring names and chasing recognition. But outside the ring, there was no script to follow, no audience to applaud. When news spread that he had murdered his ex-girlfriend, many of his peers struggled to reconcile the performer they knew with the man who had committed such a crime. It was a reminder that the personas created in wrestling are masks, and behind Donovan's mask was a person capable of real violence. The investigation into Bianca's murder revealed more about the nature of Donovan's obsession. While their relationship had ended, he had not accepted it. For him, the breakup seemed less like a separation and more like a wound to his pride. Friends of Bianca noted that she had tried to move on with her life, but Donovan had continued to hold on to her in ways that were unhealthy. That inability to let go, combined with jealousy and resentment, had built into something dangerous. The attack was not random. It was the end result of a pattern, a culmination of emotions that he never managed to control. For the detectives and prosecutors handling the case, the turning point was always his decision to post the photos on Facebook. In legal terms, it was as clear a confession as they could have asked for. Yet, beyond its use as evidence, it raised disturbing questions about why he had done it. Was it a way of showing off power? A final act of control over Bianca even in death? Or was it simply the reckless action of a man who no longer cared about consequences? Whatever his reasoning, it meant that the horror of the crime reached far beyond the crime scene itself. Those images circulated online, viewed by people who had never met Bianca or Donovan, spreading fear and outrage in equal measure. In the months that followed, the community in Tampa continued to react to the murder. For many, the case became a symbol of how obsession can turn deadly and how technology can magnify tragedy. The dog Bianca had been walking survived, but the details of that walk became forever linked to her final moments. People who lived nearby recalled the unease that came with knowing such violence had happened on their streets. Parents warned their children. Friends comforted each other. Everyone who heard the story was left with the unsettling realization that ordinary routines, like walking your dog or talking on the phone, could end in unimaginable ways when danger comes from someone you once trusted. The process of preparing for trial was deliberate and methodical. The prosecution knew that even with Donovan's reckless use of Facebook, every other aspect of the case needed to be airtight. Forensic evidence was collected, documenting the knife attack and the injuries Bianca suffered. Witnesses who had heard Bianca on the phone in her final moments provided statements, filling in the timeline. Detectives reconstructed Donovan's movements leading up to the murder, establishing intent. They examined his history, his relationship with Bianca, and the behavior that pointed to obsession and instability. Piece by piece, they built the narrative that would later be presented in court. As this was happening, Bianca's family tried to balance their grief with the need for justice. Losing her was painful enough. The public nature of the crime added another layer of suffering. But they remained determined that her death would not be reduced to a headline or a social media post. They wanted her remembered as a daughter, a friend, and a young woman whose life mattered. Community members rallied around them, offering support, attending memorials, and speaking out against domestic violence and obsession. For Donovan, the reality of his situation began to sink in. Whatever career he had once pursued in wrestling was finished. His ring names, Donovan Ruddick and D.T. Porter, no longer symbolized entertainment or ambition. Instead, they became attached to reports of murder, his public identity forever stained by his actions. He was no longer a performer but a defendant, facing charges that carried the harshest possible penalties. As the years moved forward, the case remained active, making its way through the legal system. For those waiting for justice, the time felt long. Trials do not happen overnight, and the slow pace of the system can be difficult for families of victims. But each step, each hearing, and each piece of evidence added to the certainty that Donovan would face the consequences of his actions. By 2016, the case had advanced far enough that the community once again turned its attention to the courtroom, waiting to see how the story would end. The murder of Bianca McGahey was not only about one man's violence, and one woman's tragic death. It was also about how obsession can turn toxic, how private anger can spill into public horror, and how technology can make a crime visible in ways no one expects. For Tampa, it was a case that highlighted vulnerabilities that exist in relationships and in the digital age. For Bianca's family, it was about enduring a loss that could never be undone. For investigators and prosecutors, it was about ensuring that the evidence, strong as it was, would be enough to secure the justice she deserved. As the legal process moved closer to its conclusion, the weight of the case continued to hang over everyone involved. Donovan's act had been shocking, his decision to display it even more so. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Yet, until a verdict was reached, and until a sentence was handed down, the story remained open. Bianca's family waited. The public waited. And in a Florida courtroom, the final chapter of the case was about to be written. By 2016, 3 years had passed since the murder of 25-year-old Bianca McGahey in Tampa, Florida. The passage of time had not dulled the shock of her death, nor had it lessened the grief of her family and friends. For the community, her story remained present in conversations and news reports, a reminder of the devastating consequences of obsession and violence. For investigators and prosecutors, those 3 years were spent carefully assembling every piece of evidence, ensuring that when the case was brought before a jury and a judge, there would be no room for doubt. At the center of it all was Donovan Ruddock, also known in the wrestling world as Donovan Ruddock and D.T. Porter, a man in his late 30s who had turned from performer to convicted killer. The courtroom proceedings carried a heavy weight. In most trials, the prosecution has the difficult task of proving beyond reasonable doubt that the accused committed the crime. Here, the weight of evidence already leaned overwhelmingly in one direction. Donovan had not hidden his actions. He had stabbed Bianca multiple times as she walked her dog, and he had gone so far as to post photos of the aftermath on Facebook. The images were so graphic that many who saw them wished they never had. But as disturbing as they were, they provided prosecutors with an undeniable truth. Donovan was responsible for Bianca's death, and he wanted people to know it. His actions left a trail of evidence that could not be denied. Witness testimony helped establish the human side of the tragedy. Friends of Bianca remembered her as a young woman full of life, someone whose laughter and kindness touched everyone she met. They described the normalcy of her final moments, walking her dog and speaking on the phone, and how that ordinary routine was destroyed in an instant. Detectives described the crime scene, the knife wounds, and the evidence that tied Donovan directly to the murder. The Facebook posts became central pieces of the case, digital fingerprints that showed not only what had happened, but also Donovan's state of mind afterward. To prosecutors, it looked less like a man losing control and more like someone who wanted to make a statement, however twisted that statement might have been. As the trial unfolded, the theme that had been present since the crime became clear. This was a case about obsession and control, about a man who could not let go of a relationship and instead chose to destroy the life of the woman who had moved on. Donovan's age and background in wrestling added another layer to the story. He was not a young man in the throes of youthful mistakes. He was in his late 30s, old enough to know better, someone who had lived through years of professional and personal struggles. Bianca, by contrast, was only 25, just beginning her adult life. The imbalance between them underscored the cruelty of what had happened. At one point during the proceedings, Donovan's own words and actions came into play. While he did not write a detailed confession at the time of the murder, his decision to post photos of Bianca's death was treated as an implicit confession. In the eyes of the court, it was more powerful than words. By putting those images online, he admitted to the world what he had done. And when questioned, he did not deny his role. The evidence left him with no space for denial. His defense team could only argue around the edges of intent, trying to paint a picture of a man who had lost control. But the overwhelming brutality of the attack and the cold calculation of sharing the aftermath made such arguments hollow. The turning point for those watching came when the jury heard the combined narrative: Bianca's final walk, the confrontation, the knife attack, the phone call cut short, and the bloody photographs that appeared on social media. piece by piece, the events of that day were reconstructed, and they left no question as to Donovan's guilt. The prosecution described it as a deliberate act, a murder carried out with intent, followed by an act of exhibition that showed not remorse but arrogance. For Bianca's family, listening to these details was agonizing, but they sat through it because they wanted the truth heard in full. By July 2016, the time for judgment arrived. The jury delivered its verdict, guilty of murder. The conviction was not surprising to anyone following the case. What remained was the sentencing, the final step in a process that had stretched on for 3 long years. In Florida, punishments for murder are among the harshest in the nation, and prosecutors made it clear they would seek the maximum. They argued that the brutality of the attack, the public nature of Donovan's actions, and the lack of remorse he showed all pointed to one conclusion: he should never be allowed to walk free again. The judge agreed. In a solemn courtroom, the sentence was handed down: life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the strongest punishment available short of the death penalty, and it ensured that Donovan would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Bianca's family, the sentence was both a relief and a burden. It brought justice, but it could not bring Bianca back. Her absence remained, her laughter silenced, her future stolen. Still, knowing that Donovan could not harm anyone else provided a measure of closure. He had taken her life, but he would not reclaim his own freedom. In the aftermath of the sentencing, reflections on the case highlighted several themes. First was the danger of obsession and the inability to let go. Donovan's refusal to accept the end of his relationship with Bianca had fueled the violence that ended her life. Second was the disturbing role of social media in the crime. By posting photos of Bianca's death, Donovan had transformed his private act of violence into a public event, forcing countless others to witness the aftermath. It was a reminder of how technology can magnify tragedy in ways that were unthinkable in earlier times. Finally, the case underscored the importance of justice and the resilience of families. Bianca's loved ones endured the worst possible loss, yet they stood together through the trial, determined to see the process through to its end. For the wrestling community, the case left a permanent scar. Donovan Ruddock, once known in the ring as Donovan Ruddock and D.T. Porter, would never again be remembered for his performances. His names, once associated with the world of entertainment, became synonymous with violence and murder. His legacy was sealed not in the ring, but in a courtroom, defined by the worst act of his life. As the years passed, the case of Donovan Ruddock and the murder of Bianca McGahey continued to be referenced in true crime accounts and community discussions. It remained a story of how personal anger and obsession can escalate into deadly violence, how a single act can devastate families and communities, and how justice, while imperfect, can at least ensure accountability. Donovan's life sentence stood as a permanent reminder that choices have consequences, and that the line between control and destruction, once crossed, leaves nothing but ruin. For Bianca, the tragedy was that her life ended at just 25 years old, stolen from her family and friends by someone who once claimed to care for her. Her story became part of a broader conversation about domestic violence, jealousy, and the dangers of toxic relationships. Community groups used her case to raise awareness, urging others to recognize warning signs and to take threats seriously. Though her life was taken, her story continued to inspire efforts to protect others from meeting the same fate. The final chapter of the case closed with Donovan in prison, sentenced to spend his remaining years behind bars, and Bianca's family left to carry her memory forward. In Tampa, the echoes of the crime lingered, a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can be shattered by violence, and how the pursuit of justice, though painful, can bring some measure of peace to those left behind. In Las Vegas, where ambition and glamour often hide darker truths, the shocking case of Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan exposed how fame and success in the fitness world could spiral into violence. What began as a promising partnership ended in murder, betrayal, and the destruction of 3 lives forever. Las Vegas in the early 2000s was a city where dreams could rise quickly, but where ambition and recklessness often collided. The Strip promised wealth, fame, and opportunity, and for many athletes and entertainers, it was the stage on which they tried to build their lives. Among those who settled, there were Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan, a couple well known in bodybuilding and fitness circles. They were celebrated in magazines, admired at competitions, and photographed for their physiques and dedication. But beneath the image of discipline and success was a story of excess, jealousy, and eventually violence. Craig Titus was a professional bodybuilder in his late 30s. He had competed at high levels, earning recognition within the industry for his muscular size and flamboyant presence. His reputation extended beyond the stage. He was outspoken, sometimes confrontational, and carried himself with a kind of arrogance that made him as disliked by some as he was admired by others. His past already included brushes with the law, including drug-related issues, and those who knew him well often described him as someone drawn to trouble. Still, his career in bodybuilding gave him a platform, and he remained a familiar name in the sport. Kelly Ryan, in her early 30s, was a different kind of star. Known as Flyin' Ryan, she was one of the most popular fitness competitors of her time. Her routines combined acrobatics, athletic choreography, and showmanship. She was charismatic, photogenic, and frequently featured in fitness magazines. Kelly's fame in the fitness community matched Craig's in bodybuilding, and together they were seen as a power couple. They married, settled in Las Vegas, and from the outside appeared to be living a life of opportunity and success. They had money, recognition, and a house in a city that thrived on performance and spectacle. Their lives intersected with a young woman named Melissa James. Melissa was 28 years old, originally from Florida, with dreams of acting and dancing. She was described by those who knew her as energetic and hopeful, someone chasing opportunity and trying to establish herself in the entertainment world. Melissa eventually moved west and came into contact with Craig and Kelly, who offered her a job as their personal assistant. She moved into their Las Vegas home, a decision that seemed to promise stability, but instead placed her at the center of their chaotic lifestyle. The household was not what Melissa might have expected. Craig and Kelly's private life was far from the polished image they displayed in public. Drugs played a role, with methamphetamine and steroids fueling their moods and decisions. Friends who spent time in the house described it as unstable, a place where arguments were common and trust was thin. Melissa's position as an assistant blurred boundaries. She was not just an employee, but also lived with the couple, which made every disagreement personal. Tensions grew, and jealousy and suspicion began to cloud the relationship between the three. In December 2005, those tensions reached a breaking point. On December 14th, firefighters in Las Vegas were dispatched to a call in the desert, where a red Jaguar was burning. The car belonged to Kelly Ryan. When crews extinguished the fire and opened the trunk, they made a disturbing discovery. Inside was the body of a woman. She had been gagged, bound, and burned. The condition of the remains made identification difficult, but investigators soon confirmed the victim was Melissa James, the same assistant who had been living with Craig and Kelly. From the beginning, investigators viewed the couple with suspicion. The car was registered to Kelly, and Melissa had not been seen for days. Police questioned both Craig and Kelly, but their answers were inconsistent. Details shifted, explanations contradicted each other, and instead of clarifying events, the couple seemed evasive. The fact that Melissa's body was found in Kelly's car tied them directly to the crime scene, and suspicion quickly hardened into pursuit. Rather than cooperate with authorities, Craig and Kelly fled Las Vegas. Their sudden disappearance only deepened the mystery. News of the burned car and Melissa's body had already spread, and the idea that two well-known fitness celebrities might be involved in her death drew national attention. For law enforcement, the case was no longer just a homicide investigation, but a manhunt. For the public, it became a shocking spectacle. A bodybuilding couple who once graced magazine covers, now fugitives on the run. They did not leave alone. Joining them on their flight was a young acquaintance of Kelly's, a friend in her early 20s who helped drive them out of Nevada. The trio moved quickly across states, attempting to stay ahead of the headlines and the police. But it was difficult to stay hidden. Craig and Kelly's faces were well known in their industry, and now they were featured on news broadcasts across the country. The burning car, the bound body, and the flight from police made for a story that captivated audiences far beyond the bodybuilding world. The chase stretched over days. While traveling, Craig and Kelly reached out to friends, attempting to downplay their role and convince others that the situation was not as it appeared. But the evidence was overwhelming. The victim had been living in their home, the car belonged to Kelly, and the attempts to run made them appear guilty even before a trial began. Law enforcement agencies across state lines coordinated their search, tracking tips and sightings as the couple moved east. Eventually, the manhunt ended far from Nevada. In late December 2005, Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan were captured in Massachusetts. The arrest was uneventful compared to the dramatic story that had led to it, but their capture was headline news. Two figures who once embodied discipline and control in the fitness world were now in handcuffs, accused of being at the center of a violent crime. Melissa James, a young woman who had sought opportunity in Las Vegas, was dead, and the couple who employed her were accused of being responsible. When Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan were taken into custody in late December 2005, the story that had begun with a burning car in the Nevada desert became one of the most closely followed criminal cases in the fitness world. Their arrest in Massachusetts marked the end of a cross-country manhunt, but it was only the beginning of the legal process. Investigators now had to piece together what had happened inside the Titus Ryan household in the days leading up to Melissa James's death, and prosecutors had to decide how to present a case against two people who had once been admired public figures. The first task for investigators was to reconstruct Melissa's final days. She had been living with Craig and Kelly in their Las Vegas home as a personal assistant. Friends of Melissa told police that she had been unhappy and wanted to leave. There were conflicts about money, and suspicions had risen that she might have been stealing from the couple. Others claimed that jealousy also played a role, with tensions flaring between Melissa and Kelly over Craig's attention. The household was described by those who had visited as chaotic, often fueled by drugs and volatile emotions. This backdrop of mistrust, dependency, and confrontation provided investigators with a picture of the unstable environment in which Melissa's life ended. Physical evidence told its own story. Melissa's body had been discovered bound with zip ties, gagged with cloth, and burned inside Kelly Ryan's Jaguar. The level of damage to the body made determining the exact cause of death difficult, but the bindings and the effort to destroy evidence pointed clearly to foul play. Arson investigators confirmed that an accelerant had been used to set the car on fire. For prosecutors, this detail was crucial. It suggested that not only had Melissa been restrained, but that there had been a deliberate attempt to conceal or destroy the evidence afterward. Witness statements began to surface. Neighbors recalled arguments and unusual activity at the Titus Ryan home around the time Melissa disappeared. Some friends came forward to say that Craig had boasted about being able to handle the situation, while others mentioned that Kelly appeared distraught and overwhelmed. The image of a glamorous, disciplined couple was falling apart under the weight of these accounts. What emerged was a picture of a pair living recklessly, unable to separate their personal demons from their public personas. The timeline became clearer. Investigators believed that an argument inside the home escalated into violence. Melissa was subdued, restrained, and rendered unable to move. How she died was debated, whether it was from strangulation, an overdose, or some other means. But what was not in question was that she was dead before being placed in the car. Craig and Kelly, faced with a body in their home, attempted to cover it up. They placed Melissa's body in the trunk of Kelly's car, drove it to a remote location, and set the vehicle on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. The plan was desperate and sloppy, and it only drew more attention to them once the car was found and traced back to Kelly. The couple's decision to flee Las Vegas after the discovery was another piece of evidence that worked against them. Leaving town, aided by a younger friend who drove them across states, was seen as a sign of consciousness of guilt. The FBI and local police followed their trail east, tracking calls and reported sightings until they were eventually caught. Their capture was covered widely in the media, and suddenly the bodybuilding community found itself under scrutiny for reasons it had never expected. Fitness magazines that had once featured Craig and Kelly on glossy covers were now reporting on their mugshots. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors charged Craig Titus with second-degree murder, kidnapping, and arson. The charges reflected the belief that Melissa had been forcibly restrained, killed, and then burned in an effort to erase the crime. Kelly Ryan faced charges of arson and other related crimes, as her car was central to the cover-up and her presence tied her directly to the events. The severity of the charges meant that both faced decades in prison if convicted. In court filings, the defense tried to frame the incident differently. They suggested that Melissa's death was not a premeditated murder, but the result of a confrontation gone wrong. Craig's lawyers hinted at drug use and argued that Melissa may have overdosed or died accidentally, and that the panicked actions afterward were an attempt to cover up a tragedy rather than commit a deliberate killing. Kelly's defense emphasized her emotional dependence on Craig and sought to portray her as less involved, caught up in events she did not control. The prosecution, however, stressed the brutality of the restraints, the deliberate burning of the car, and the fact that Melissa had clearly not died peacefully. The pre-trial period was marked by delays, motions, and debates over evidence. Questions about the exact cause of death complicated matters. Because Melissa's body was so badly burned, medical examiners could not determine with absolute certainty how she had died. This opened the door for the defense to argue alternative theories, including that Melissa had overdosed on drugs. But even with those uncertainties, the fact that she had been bound and gagged was undeniable. For the prosecution, this was proof enough that a violent act had taken place. Media coverage of the case was intense. Television networks, newspapers, and online outlets followed each development closely. The spectacle of two fitness celebrities accused of such a brutal crime was too sensational to ignore. Reporters dug into Craig's past, uncovering his earlier arrests and drug problems. They highlighted Kelly's once promising career and the sharp contrast between her graceful performances on stage and her mugshot in court. The bodybuilding and fitness communities, already niche but loyal, watched in shock as two of their stars became infamous for reasons no one could have predicted. Family members of Melissa James also became part of the story. From Florida, they spoke publicly about their grief, remembering Melissa as a hopeful young woman who had moved west chasing dreams of success. They expressed frustration at the defense's claims and pressed for accountability. Their voices reminded the public that beyond the sensational headlines, this was the loss of a daughter, a sister, and a friend whose life had ended violently and prematurely. As the legal process dragged on, the spotlight remained fixed on Craig and Kelly. Every hearing was reported, every statement dissected. Behind the scenes, negotiations began, as both sides weighed the risks of going to trial with uncertain forensic evidence against the certainty of plea agreements. For Craig, facing the most serious charges, the possibility of a life sentence loomed. For Kelly, the decision was whether to stand by her husband and risk decades in prison herself or distance her role in hopes of a lighter outcome. Both paths carried heavy consequences, and the pressure grew as the trial date approached. By 2007 and into 2008, the case had evolved into a courtroom drama that mixed celebrity, crime, and tragedy. What had started as a shocking discovery in the desert was now a full-scale prosecution of two once famous athletes. Every detail of their private lives was dragged into the open: drug use, infidelities, financial troubles. All of it painting a picture of a couple whose glamorous exterior masked a dangerous reality. Melissa James's presence in their lives, meant to bring support and assistance, had instead ended with her death and their downfall. By the time the case of Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan reached its final stages in 2008, the spectacle surrounding it had stretched for years. What began with the discovery of a burned body in a Las Vegas desert had become a drawn-out legal battle filled with delays, motions, and a public eager for resolution. The courtroom was the final stage where the rise and fall of the bodybuilding couple would be put on full display. For prosecutors, the goal was to hold both accountable for the death of Melissa James. For the defense, it was a desperate effort to reduce the damage, to find a path that would spare Craig and Kelly from spending the rest of their lives in prison. The case against them had been built from the ground up by investigators who worked through a tangle of evidence that was at times incomplete. Melissa's body had been too badly burned to pinpoint a precise cause of death. This was one of the most difficult aspects for prosecutors. They had the bindings, the gag, and the burn car, but when it came to saying exactly how Melissa died, the science could not provide certainty. It was an opening the defense seized on repeatedly. They argued that Melissa might not have been murdered in the traditional sense, but had instead overdosed on drugs in the house. The claim was that Craig and Kelly panicked, tied her up, and tried to dispose of her body in a reckless attempt to cover up what was, in their version, an accidental death. For the jury pool and the public, the defense's argument sounded less convincing than the picture painted by the prosecution, which described a violent household, a fight that turned deadly, and an effort to erase the evidence with fire. The prosecutors emphasized the circumstances. Melissa was bound with zip ties, her mouth gagged, her body placed in a trunk, and set ablaze with an accelerant. Even if the exact cause of death could not be named with precision, the steps taken afterward, they argued, were the actions of people who knew they had committed a crime and wanted to cover it up. They also pointed to the fact that Craig and Kelly fled the state rather than face questioning, traveling across the country with the help of a young friend until being arrested in Massachusetts. That act of running, prosecutors said, spoke louder than their claims of innocence. As the proceedings dragged forward, both Craig and Kelly faced difficult choices. The possibility of trial carried enormous risks. If convicted of first-degree murder, Craig faced the chance of spending the rest of his life in prison. Kelly, though not accused of directly killing Melissa, was tied to arson, the disposal of the body, and her role in the events that unfolded. For her too, a conviction could mean decades behind bars. With those risks in mind, negotiations began. Prosecutors were willing to accept plea deals, knowing that a trial with uncertain forensic evidence carried the danger of acquittal. For Craig and Kelly, the deals were a way to avoid the harshest penalties. In 2008, Craig Titus entered a guilty plea to charges of second-degree murder, kidnapping, and arson. The decision ended years of speculation about whether he would take his chances before a jury. His plea acknowledged responsibility without forcing the prosecution to prove first-degree murder, which carried the highest burden. The judge sentenced Craig to a prison term ranging from 21 to 55 years. For him, it meant that even with good behavior, he would likely spend decades behind bars, with the possibility that he might never walk free again. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the difficulty prosecutors had in establishing the exact cause of Melissa's death. Kelly Ryan, whose role had been secondary but still significant, also chose a plea deal. She admitted guilt to charges of arson and assault with a deadly weapon. The plea allowed her to avoid the most severe outcomes while still holding her accountable for her part in Melissa's death and the cover-up that followed. Kelly was sentenced to prison, and while her sentence was substantial, it was far shorter than Craig's. For her, there was a clear possibility of eventual release, a chance at life beyond the prison walls. The sentencing brought some measure of closure for Melissa James's family, though no outcome could undo what had happened. They had endured years of legal delays and had listened to the defense portray Melissa in ways they felt were unfair. For them, the plea deals at least ensured that both Craig and Kelly were held responsible in some way for Melissa's death and the attempt to erase her existence by fire. Melissa's story, of a young woman who left Florida seeking opportunity and instead met a violent end in Las Vegas, became central to the public's memory of the case. The bodybuilding and fitness communities reacted with disbelief and disappointment. Craig and Kelly had once been celebrated figures, admired for their discipline and achievements. Now they were remembered not for their championships or magazine covers, but for a brutal crime that shocked their industry. Fitness magazines that had once celebrated Kelly's dynamic routines and Craig's competitions now documented their fall. For many, the case served as a reminder that success on stage did not translate to stability or morality in private life. Craig adjusted to life in prison, where he would remain for decades. His name faded from the bodybuilding spotlight, known only in connection to the crime that ended Melissa's life. Kelly, on the other hand, did not remain behind bars forever. After serving over a decade of her sentence, she was granted parole in 2017. By then, the world she had once thrived in was long gone. Her release drew renewed media attention, with outlets revisiting the case and reminding the public of the shocking fall from grace of a woman who had once been one of the brightest stars in fitness competition. For Kelly, freedom came with the weight of her past, and the stigma of her involvement in Melissa's death followed her beyond prison. The conclusion of the case left behind a theme that resonated beyond Las Vegas or the bodybuilding scene. It was a story of ambition gone astray, of people who had achieved recognition and success, but whose private lives were filled with jealousy, drugs, and poor decisions. Craig and Kelly, admired by many, destroyed their own reputations and futures through violence and desperation. Melissa James, at only 28, lost her chance to pursue her dreams because she trusted the wrong people in a city where opportunity and danger often blurred together. The crime captured attention because of who Craig and Kelly were, but its impact went further. It reminded people that fame and discipline on the outside could hide dysfunction and chaos on the inside. It showed how jealousy and mistrust could spiral into violence, and how the attempt to cover up a crime often becomes the evidence that seals a person's fate. In the end, Craig Titus's long prison term and Kelly Ryan's years behind bars were the price paid for choices that turned deadly in December 2005. For the families involved, the case never truly ended. Melissa's loved ones were left with loss and memories of a life cut short. Craig's and Kelly's families carried the burden of watching their children fall from public success into criminal infamy. For the public, the story of Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan stands as one of Las Vegas's darkest true crime cases, a tale of ambition, ego, and the destruction that followed when violence took over a household already on the edge. On a quiet February night in Campbellsville, Kentucky, a university dorm turned into the scene of an unthinkable crime. Two young wrestlers, once teammates, were suddenly bound in tragedy. One dead, the other accused of killing him. What happened inside that room would haunt the community forever. Campbellsville, Kentucky, is a small city surrounded by rolling hills, farmland, and a close-knit community where people know each other's names. At its heart sits Campbellsville University, a private Christian school that draws students from across the region. It's a kind of place where life is supposed to be safe and steady, where young people focus on academics, athletics, and friendships. That sense of security was shattered in February 2024 when a crime unfolded inside the dormitories of a university that would leave the town in disbelief. Charles Zeke Escalera was 21 years old. He was a student at the university, a member of the wrestling team, and someone who on the surface fit in with the rhythm of campus life. Teammates described him as competitive, dedicated to the sport, and living the disciplined lifestyle that wrestling often demands. He was still young, navigating the pressures of both college life and athletics, but to those around him, he seemed like any other student working toward a future. At Campbellsville, wrestling carried pride. It was a team that brought students together, and Escalera was part of that circle. Josiah Malachi Kilman was 18 years old. He had just begun his college journey at Campbellsville, stepping into adulthood with promise ahead of him. Like Escalera, he was on the wrestling team, sharing the same training routines and the same environment. Josiah was described as disciplined and hardworking, someone who approached both his academics and athletics with seriousness. At 18, he was just beginning to carve out his identity away from home. He lived in the university dorms, surrounded by teammates, classmates, and friends who, like him, were settling into college life. The relationship between Escalera and Kilman was defined primarily through their shared space as teammates and fellow residents of the dormitories. Wrestling demands grueling practice, weight control, and mental toughness, and those who take part in it often form close bonds. Yet in February 2024, something went drastically wrong between these two young men. What happened inside their shared environment left a permanent scar not only on their team, but on the wider university and community. It was in the dorm room where the incident began. According to investigators, Josiah Kilman was attacked and strangled. The details of what led to this act remain unclear. There were no public reports of conflict between the two athletes leading up to the crime. In fact, the lack of a clear motive quickly became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Escalera's actions were swift and devastating, and by the time help could be reached, Kilman's life had already been taken. For a university that prided itself on safety and community, the sudden eruption of violence within its own walls was shocking. Once Kilman was found unresponsive, the reality of the situation came crashing down. Students and faculty were stunned. Police were called immediately, and a full search for Escalera began. He had fled the dormitory after the attack, and his whereabouts were unknown. For hours, law enforcement combed the area around campus, working quickly to contain the situation. Fear rippled through the student body. The university was supposed to be a protected space, and the idea that one student had killed another sent a wave of anxiety across the grounds. The search did not last long. Surveillance footage became critical in tracing Escalera's movements. Cameras around the campus showed him leaving the scene, and police used the footage to track his path. Their efforts led them to a nearby barn, not far from the university. There, they found him hiding. Escalera was wearing a t-shirt stained with blood, clothing that matched what had been recorded on surveillance. The sight of him in that barn, alone, became one of the most unforgettable images tied to the case. He was taken into custody without further incident, but the questions had only just begun. Investigators began piecing together the timeline. They interviewed students, teammates, and faculty, trying to understand how something like this could happen. Escalera's arrest was swift, but clarity about why he had acted remained absent. At the heart of their inquiry was the same question that the community kept asking. What drove a young man to kill his teammate? Police records indicate that when Escalera was confronted, he confessed openly. He told authorities, "I killed a man." Those words sealed his connection to the crime. His statement turned suspicion into certainty, but it did not offer explanation. The motive was still a blank space. The impact on the university community was immediate. Students gathered in grief, struggling to process the loss of one of their own and the arrest of another. Professors, coaches, and administrators worked to provide support, but the shock was too raw. Wrestling teammates were especially devastated, caught between mourning Josiah and reconciling the reality of Zeke's arrest. The duality of loss, losing a teammate to violence and another to imprisonment, was almost too much to comprehend. For Campbellsville residents, the story spread quickly. Local news reported on the arrest, the crime, and the emotional aftermath. Parents who sent their children to the university worried about safety, wondering how a tragedy like this could erupt on campus. The barn where Escalera was found became a symbol of how far from normal life the story had strayed. Campbellsville is not a large city. It is the kind of place where people expect to know their neighbors and to feel secure. For something so brutal to occur within the student community struck at the heart of that trust. Law enforcement handled the case with urgency, aware of how deeply it had shaken both the university and the town. The evidence, the bloodied shirt, the surveillance footage, and the confession pointed directly to Escalera. Yet even as the investigation advanced, the absence of a clear motive loomed large. Without understanding the why, the case carried a sense of incompleteness. Every update from police or campus officials left the same unanswered question hanging in the air. Escalera's words admitted guilt, but they left behind mystery. The wider story, however, was already set in motion. A young man of 18, with his future ahead of him, was gone. Another, just 21, had turned from teammate to suspect to accused killer. In a matter of hours, a university dorm had transformed into a crime scene, a barn into a hiding place, and a small Kentucky town into the backdrop of a tragedy that would not be forgotten quickly. For Campbellsville, this was more than just a crime. It was a moment when the ordinary world of college life was invaded by violence, leaving grief, confusion, and a desperate search for understanding in its wake. The days that followed the death of Josiah Malachi Kilman were heavy with grief and disbelief. Inside Campbellsville University, the atmosphere shifted from the familiar rhythm of classes and practices to a campus overtaken by mourning. The wrestling team, once united by long hours on the mat, was now caught in a storm of tragedy. Teammates who trained alongside both Josiah and Zeke were left searching for answers that did not come. They had lost one of their youngest members to violence, and another had been taken away in handcuffs, accused of committing the crime. The dual loss created a silence that seemed to echo through the dorms, the locker rooms, and every corner of campus life. Students gathered for vigils, lighting candles, and praying for Josiah's family. Professors spoke quietly in classrooms, trying to help their students process the shock. Counselors made themselves available, but no amount of guidance could undo the trauma of what had taken place. For many on campus, Josiah was not just another face in the hallway. He was a friend, a teammate, and a student who had just begun to build his life. At only 18 years old, his death felt unbearably premature, and the fact that it came at the hands of someone so close to him only deepened the wound. In Campbellsville, the town outside the university gates, the case was the only subject of conversation. Local residents felt the crime as if it had touched their own families. The idea that a murder had taken place on a quiet Christian campus shook the community's sense of safety. Parents who had sent their children to study in what they believed was a safe environment now felt unsettled. Churches offered prayers, and neighbors reached out to comfort one another. The barn where Zeke was discovered became a grim landmark, a reminder of how close the violence had come to their daily lives. Law enforcement continued to work carefully through the evidence. The blood-stained T-shirt Zeke wore when he was arrested, the surveillance footage that traced his movements, and the confession he gave when taken into custody built a clear picture of responsibility. Police statements confirmed that Zeke admitted to killing Josiah. Yet despite the strength of the evidence, investigators struggled to identify a motive. They spoke to fellow students, teammates, and faculty members, hoping to uncover any signs of conflict or instability that might explain why Zeke turned violent. The lack of answers frustrated not only the investigators, but also the families, the students, and the town. Without knowing why, the crime seemed even more senseless. As the investigation unfolded, the university administration faced the difficult task of addressing both grief and fear. Campbellsville University prided itself on being a place where students felt protected and supported, but now parents and students alike questioned how such a tragedy could occur inside a dormitory. The administration issued statements offering condolences to Josiah's family and pledging full cooperation with law enforcement. They arranged memorial services and encouraged students to lean on their faith and community for strength. Still, even as they spoke words of comfort, the reality of what had taken place overshadowed every attempt at reassurance. The Kilman family was at the center of the sorrow. Their son had left home to pursue his education and his sport, and instead, they were confronted with the devastating news of his death. Friends and relatives remembered Josiah as a young man full of promise, someone disciplined and devoted to his goals. His parents and siblings were left to navigate the grief of losing him so suddenly and in such a violent way. The community rallied around them, but no amount of support could ease the pain of their loss. They had entrusted Josiah to the university, believing he was beginning a bright chapter of life, only to have it end before it truly began. The Escalera family faced a different kind of anguish. For them, the arrest of Zeke meant grappling with the fact that their son, only 21 years old, had become the central figure in a crime that shocked an entire community. They were forced to reconcile the young man they had raised with the reality of his actions. The confession he gave left little room for denial. The family's name was now tied to a tragedy, and they were left to face questions about what had gone wrong, questions they themselves could not answer. They, too, became victims of the choices Zeke had made, carrying the weight of his actions in silence. The wrestling program at Campbellsville, once a point of pride, suddenly found itself overshadowed by grief. The team lost 2 members in a single night, one to death, the other to arrest. Coaches struggled to find words for their athletes, who were left reeling from the loss of their teammate and the betrayal of another. Practices and competitions seemed unimportant in the face of such devastation. The mat, which had once symbolized discipline and camaraderie, now carried the memory of a team broken apart. For young athletes who had looked to wrestling as a source of structure and purpose, the tragedy left them adrift. As weeks passed, the story spread beyond Campbellsville. Regional and national media outlets reported on the case, drawing attention to the shocking nature of the crime. Headlines highlighted the contrast between the ordinary world of college athletics and the extraordinary violence that had taken place within it. The names of both Josiah and Zeke became known far beyond Kentucky, carried into the public eye by the sheer tragedy of the story. The case drew attention not only because of the crime itself, but also because of the unanswered questions that continued to surround it. Despite the media attention, the investigation remained steady. Police stuck to the facts they had gathered. They confirmed Josiah's cause of death as strangulation. They confirmed Zeke's arrest in the barn and his confession afterward. But beyond these details, they withheld speculation. The absence of a motive meant they could not offer the public the closure it wanted. For the families and the community, the silence around why the crime had occurred was almost as painful as the act itself. It left them with a wound that could not fully heal, because it carried no explanation. The story of that February night became less about the physical details of what had happened and more about the emotional devastation it caused. Josiah's death left a hole in his family, in his team, and in the university. Zeke's actions left confusion, disbelief, and sorrow. Together, the 2 young men, one as victim, the other as accused killer, became locked in a story that the community could not escape. Every retelling returned to the same unbearable truth, that a dormitory meant for study and rest had become the site of violence, and a barn meant for work and storage had become the place of capture. The tragedy reshaped Campbellsville University. Faculty and administrators looked for ways to restore trust, but it was clear that things would never feel the same. Students continued to attend classes, but an invisible shadow lingered across campus. Parents hesitated when sending their children back, wondering about the safety of a place that had once seemed so secure. Coaches tried to restore focus to their teams, but the absence of Josiah and the arrest of Zeke remained impossible to ignore. For many, the crime became a permanent marker in time, a before and after that divided campus life. By the end of those first months, the community knew the case was far from over. Legal proceedings lay ahead, and answers, if they were ever to come, would only surface in court. But for Campbellsville, the damage was already done. A small town with a quiet university had been thrust into a nightmare, one that would not be forgotten quickly. Every vigil, every gathering, every whispered conversation carried the weight of February 2024. It was a moment when life in Campbellsville was transformed forever, not by natural disaster or accident, but by the violence of one young man against another. And in that transformation, the town and the university were left struggling to understand how such darkness could emerge in a place that had once felt so safe. As the weeks turned into months, the case of Charles Zeke Escalera and the death of Josiah Malachi Kilman remained a central focus in Campbellsville and beyond. The university community carried its grief in the quiet spaces of classrooms, dining halls, and practice rooms, while the wider public followed the case through news updates and official court filings. Everyone knew that the legal process would eventually bring the story into the open again, where testimony, evidence, and the voice of justice would attempt to bring clarity to a crime that had left so many questions unanswered. The investigation continued steadily, gathering the full scope of physical and testimonial evidence. Detectives documented the crime scene in the dormitory where Josiah had been found, reviewing every trace and every possible clue. They examined the surveillance footage that captured Zeke leaving campus in a state of panic, a record that showed his movements in the immediate aftermath of the killing. They processed the blood-stained shirt he wore when he was discovered in the barn, ensuring that nothing was left unexamined. These details formed the foundation of a case that, while lacking a clear motive, presented a damning picture of responsibility. Meanwhile, the families lived in the long shadow of loss and disgrace. For the Kilman family, every day without Josiah was a reminder of the life that had been stolen. He had been only 18 years old, just beginning to map out his path in the world. His parents were left with the unbearable absence of their son, and his friends and siblings were forced to carry forward without him. They leaned on faith on their church and on the community around them, but no source of comfort could erase the sharp finality of his death. Their grief became part of the public record, a reflection of the human cost behind the court documents and news headlines. For the Escalera family, the pain took a different shape. Their son, only 21 years old, now sat in custody, accused of murder. They, too, had once imagined a promising future for him, a life shaped by education and athletic opportunity. Now they were left with the reality that he had confessed to taking another young man's life, and the world would remember his name not for achievement, but for violence. They were silent in public, knowing that any words would be weighed against the weight of the crime. Their sorrow was quieter, but it was real. They had lost a son to the justice system, and they carried that burden with them each day. The campus tried to return to normal, but the shadow of February's tragedy lingered. Students adjusted to the routines of classes, but trust was fractured. The dormitories, once thought of as safe, carried memories that could not be erased. Wrestling teammates continued to train, but the mat felt different. Every practice carried an absence, a reminder of Josiah's energy and the sudden disappearance of Zeke. Coaches tried to guide their athletes forward, but the weight of loss slowed every step. The university's administration worked tirelessly to provide counseling and reassurance, but there was no easy repair for the scar left behind. When the time came for legal proceedings, the courtroom became the new stage for the tragedy. Prosecutors presented their evidence methodically, laying out the story as clearly as possible. They described how Josiah had been strangled in the dorm room, how Zeke had fled, and how he had been found hiding in the barn. They showed the bloodied shirt, the surveillance footage, and most powerfully, they repeated the words Zeke had said to investigators, "I killed man." The statement was direct and devastating. It cut through speculation and defense. It established in Zeke's own voice his responsibility for the crime. The defense faced a nearly impossible task. With a confession on record and physical evidence backing it, their focus shifted to Zeke's state of mind. They questioned what might have been happening internally, whether mental health issues or overwhelming stress could have played a role. They suggested that the lack of a clear motive was itself a sign of instability, something that required deeper understanding rather than simple condemnation. But for the jury and for the public, the central fact remained. Josiah was dead, and Zeke had admitted to causing his death. The defense could not undo that truth. As the trial unfolded, the community watched closely. For some, it was the first time they had seen the details laid out in full, beyond the snippets of news coverage. For others, it was a painful reopening of wounds that had only begun to scar. Family members sat through testimony, carrying grief on their faces as they listened to the details of how Josiah's life had been taken. Every word in court was another reminder of what they had lost. Every piece of evidence was another confirmation of the brutality of that night. The turning point of the trial came when Zeke's confession was played and recounted. His words, simple and haunting, left no room for doubt. In that moment, the story shifted from questioning his involvement to determining his fate. The jury weighed the evidence carefully, but the conclusion seemed clear. The prosecution had built a case that tied together every piece of physical evidence with Zeke's own admission. The defense had no alternative explanation strong enough to counter it. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavy with the inevitability of the verdict. In the end, Charles Zeke Escalera, was convicted. The jury found him guilty of strangling his teammate, Josiah Malachi Kilman, in the dormitory of Campbellsville University. The conviction brought a measure of closure to the case, but it did not answer the lingering question of why. The motive remained elusive, and perhaps it always would. Zeke's actions were undeniable, but his reasons were buried in silence, leaving the families and the community with a gap that no verdict could fill. Sentencing followed, and with it came the final chapter of the legal process. The court imposed punishment fitting for the crime, ensuring that Zeke would spend years behind bars, separated from the life he once had. The decision marked the end of the courtroom battle, but it was not the end of the story for those left behind. The Kilman family would never see Josiah again. The Escalera family would never see Zeke free. The university would never fully heal from the wound carved into its history. Justice had been served, but healing was far more complicated. For Campbellsville, the case became a lasting memory, one that shaped the identity of the town and the university. It was a reminder that even in places where life feels safe and steady, tragedy can strike without warning. The dorm room, the barn, the courtroom, all became landmarks in a story that left its mark on everyone connected to it. Students who were there in 2024 would remember it for the rest of their lives. Professors, coaches, and administrators would carry the lessons of that time with them. The town itself would forever associate February 2024 with the night safety was shattered. The story of Charles Zeke Escalera and Josiah Malachi Kilman was more than just a crime. It was a story of two young men whose lives collided in violence, leaving behind devastation for two families, a university, and a community. One was a victim, his future stolen before it had even begun. The other was a perpetrator, his future destroyed by his own actions. Together, their names became inseparable, woven into a narrative of grief, shock, and unanswered questions. The case left behind lessons about fragility, about the unpredictable nature of human behavior, and about the lasting scars of violence. In the end, the confession, the conviction, and the sentencing closed the legal book on the case, but the human story continued. Josiah's memory lived on in his family, his friends, and his teammates. Zeke's actions lived on in the consequences he now faced. Campbellsville carried both, holding onto the weight of a tragedy that began in a dormitory room and echoed far beyond it. The story remained a warning and a reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, the most extraordinary tragedies can occur, leaving behind echoes that last for generations.